I'm Rebecca, 28 years old. Just 3 hours ago, I sat in a courtroom watching my own mother try to convince a judge that I was too irresponsible to manage my own money. She wanted my bank accounts, my car, even the apartment I'd paid for entirely myself. Her lawyer smiled like victory was already guaranteed. Until the judge started reading through my financial records. His face went completely white. He stood up so fast his chair nearly fell over. Stop this proceeding immediately. Someone call security. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt betrayed by your own family. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to where this whole mess started. I was 7 years old when my mother decided I was too much trouble to handle. Rebecca's going to stay with Grandma and Grandpa for a while, she announced one Tuesday morning, my little suitcase already packed by the door. No explanation, no timeline, just a quick hug that smelled like her expensive perfume and cigarettes. Mom climbed into her red convertible and drove away to start her new life, the one where having a kid didn't cramp her style. My grandparents' estate sat on 12 acres of perfectly manicured grounds in Connecticut. The house itself was a testament to old money, marble floors, crystal chandeliers, and oil paintings worth more than most people's homes. But for all its grandeur, it became my sanctuary. Grandmother Eleanor ran that house like a Swiss watch. Breakfast at 7 sharp tutoring sessions after school, piano lessons on Thursdays. She had rules for everything: how to set a proper table, which fork to use for salad, how a lady should sit and speak. Posture, Rebecca, she'd remind me constantly. Your spine should be as straight as your character. Grandfather Charles was the softer touch, though that's relative in a family where showing emotion was considered poor breeding. He taught me about business over Sunday morning pancakes, explaining compound interest and investment portfolios like other grandfathers might discuss baseball scores. Money isn't just about having it, he'd say, pointing at his charts. It's about understanding it, respecting it, making it work for you instead of the other way around. Mom showed up for birthdays and Christmas, always with expensive gifts and dramatic stories about her latest adventures. She'd sweep in like a whirlwind, full of promises about quality time and mother-daughter bonding. But somehow, she always had somewhere else she needed to be. A friend's party, a business opportunity, a man who might be the one this time. I stopped waiting for her to take me home around age 12. By then, I understood that home was wherever people actually wanted you around. The expensive boarding school Mom chose for me when I turned 14 was supposed to be a privilege, a chance to network with other wealthy families' children. What it really was another way to keep me at arm's length while maintaining her image as a devoted mother. Ashford Academy will give you opportunities I never had, she explained during one of her brief visits, her manicured nails clicking against her phone screen as she spoke. The best families send their daughters there. What she didn't mention was that it also meant seeing her even less than before. Ashford was everything you'd expect from a school that cost more per year than most people's salaries. Small classes, pristine facilities, teachers who actually remembered your name. But it was also filled with girls who'd grown up with the same emotional distance I knew so well. We were all products of families who'd chosen success over attachment. I excelled academically because studying was safer than making friends who'd eventually leave anyway. Mathematics made sense in a way that family relationships never had. There were rules, predictable outcomes, solutions that actually worked. During breaks, while other girls flew home to family vacations and exotic locations, I returned to my grandparents' house. Grandmother Eleanor would quiz me on proper etiquette over formal dinners, while Grandfather Charles taught me about their various business holdings. I learned about real estate portfolios, stock dividends, and trust fund management before I was old enough to drive. Knowledge is power, Rebecca, Grandfather would say, showing me spreadsheets that tracked their investments. But applied knowledge is freedom. Mom's visits during those years became even more sporadic. She'd call on my birthday, sometimes remembering it was actually my birthday. Christmas cards arrived late with generic messages. Hope you're doing well in school, sweetheart. Like I was a distant relative she felt obligated to acknowledge. I graduated valedictorian at 17, earning acceptance to Harvard with a full academic scholarship. Mom actually showed up to graduation, 30 minutes late and wearing sunglasses indoors. But she was there. She posed for pictures, beaming like she'd had anything to do with my success. I'm so proud of you, darling, she gushed, her voice carrying that performative quality I'd learned to recognize. Harvard! Can you imagine? My daughter at Harvard. I could imagine it just fine. Actually, I'd been working toward it for years while she was busy being whoever she thought she needed to be that week. Harvard was where I finally started to understand who I could become when I wasn't constantly waiting for someone else's approval. Business school felt like coming home. All those conversations with grandfather Charles suddenly clicking into place as I studied finance, economics, and corporate strategy. I threw myself into my studies with the same intensity I'd applied to everything else. Magna cum laude wasn't just a goal, it was proof that I could succeed entirely on my own merit. My professors took notice, offering research opportunities and internship recommendations that would have been impossible without my academic performance. Mom's communication during this period reached new levels of sporadic. Birthday calls became birthday texts. Christmas presents came from her assistant, generic luxury items that screamed expensive but impersonal. When I graduated summa cum laude, she sent flowers with a note that said, "Congratulations! So proud." The florist's card was signed with her assistant's handwriting, but honestly, by then, her absence felt more like relief than abandonment. I'd learned to build a life that didn't require her validation. My first job at Morrison Financial started 3 days after graduation. I'd earned the position through a combination of my academic record, stellar internship reviews, and what my boss later described as the most thorough interview preparation he'd ever encountered. Grandfather Charles's business lessons had taught me to research not just the company, but their recent deals, their competitors, and their strategic challenges. Within 6 months, I was managing portfolios for clients whose monthly spending exceeded most people's annual salaries. The work came naturally: pattern recognition, risk assessment, strategic planning. All those skills my grandparents had been teaching me since childhood, packaged in a profession that paid extremely well. I bought my first apartment at 24 with money I'd saved from my salary and bonuses. Nothing extravagant, but entirely mine. When I signed the papers, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete ownership over my own life. Mom called 3 weeks later, having heard about the purchase through our family's financial network. "Darling, how exciting! Your own place." Her voice had that particular tone she used when she was fishing for information. "It must have been so expensive, though. How did you manage the down payment? Did Charles help you out?" The assumption that I couldn't possibly have achieved this on my own was so perfectly typical that I almost laughed. "I saved for it, Mom. It's called having a job." Of course. I just meant, well, you're so young to be making such big financial decisions. Maybe I should take a look at the paperwork just to make sure everything's in order." There it was, the first hint of the interest that would eventually destroy what little relationship we had left. Grandmother Eleanor's funeral was held on a gray October morning that seemed designed for grief. The Gothic chapel was packed with Connecticut's social elite, all of whom had known her for decades. They spoke about her charity work, her elegant parties, her dedication to various cultural institutions. What they couldn't capture in their polite eulogies was how she'd single-handedly shaped me into someone who could stand on her own. Every etiquette lesson, every stern correction about posture, every expectation that I conduct myself with dignity, it had all been preparation for a world that would constantly try to diminish me. Grandfather Charles didn't last 6 months without her. The doctors called it heart failure, but I knew better. 47 years of marriage doesn't just end with medical terminology. Some people die of broken hearts, no matter what the death certificate says. The reading of their will took place in the same law office where they'd conducted business for 3 decades. Mom arrived 20 minutes late, wearing black Chanel and an expression of carefully practiced grief. She'd spent more time at their funerals than she had at their house in the previous 5 years combined. "The majority of the estate," Mr. Pemberton read in his measured attorney's voice, "including all properties, investment portfolios, and business holdings, is to be transferred directly to our granddaughter, Rebecca Alexandra Morrison, with the explicit provision that these assets are to remain solely under her control." The silence that followed was profound enough to hear the antique clock ticking on the office wall. "I'm sorry," Mom said, her voice careful and controlled. "Could you repeat that? I think I misunderstood." Mr. Pemberton adjusted his glasses and reread the relevant section, word for word. No misunderstanding. My grandparents had left me everything: the Connecticut estate, their Boston penthouse, the vacation home in Martha's Vineyard, investment accounts worth more than I'd dared to calculate, and controlling interest in their various business ventures. Mom's face went through several interesting color changes before settling on a shade of pale that matched her perfectly applied foundation. "There must be some mistake. Charles and Eleanor would never—" They understood the importance of family structure, generational responsibility. "Mrs. Morrison," Mr. Pemberton interrupted gently, "your parents were quite explicit about their reasoning. They felt that Rebecca had demonstrated the maturity and capability to handle these responsibilities." What he didn't read aloud, but what I saw in the document he handed me, was their private note. "Rebecca has shown more wisdom and integrity in her young life than some people demonstrate in 7 decades. She earned this through character, not circumstance. The meeting ended with Mom requesting copies of all documentation, her voice tight with barely controlled fury. As we walked to the parking garage, she finally spoke. "This is temporary, Rebecca. You're 26 years old. No one your age should be managing assets of this magnitude without oversight." I looked at my mother, really looked at her, probably for the first time in years. She wasn't concerned about my well-being or my capabilities. She was angry that her parents had recognized something in me that she'd never bothered to see. "I'll be fine, Mom. Grandfather taught me well." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. "We'll see about that." For exactly 18 months after the inheritance, Mom played the part of the supportive mother with Academy Award-worthy commitment. She called weekly to check in, sent thoughtful gifts for no particular reason, and even suggested we take a vacation together to reconnect properly. I should have known something was wrong when she started caring about my well-being. The first red flag was her sudden interest in my financial decisions. "Darling, have you considered getting a financial advisor? Someone who really understands complex portfolios?" she'd ask during our phone calls. "I know some excellent people who specialize in inherited wealth. It's so different from earned income, you know." The second red flag was her newfound concern about my living alone. "That apartment is lovely, Rebecca, but don't you think it's time for something more appropriate? Something that reflects your new position? I could help you look for something more suitable." By month 15, her suggestions had become more direct. "You know, sweetheart, I've been thinking. It might be wise to put some of the inheritance in both our names, just for tax purposes. Estate planning can be so complex, and you want to make sure everything's properly protected." I'd learned enough about family dynamics from watching my grandparents' friends to recognize manipulation when I saw it. But I'd also learned enough about business to document everything carefully. Every phone call, every suggestion, every gradual escalation of her interest in my finances went into a file that would later prove more valuable than I could have imagined. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in April when I found Mom sitting in my apartment building's lobby, chatting with the concierge like they were old friends. "Surprise!" she announced, as if unauthorized visits were a delightful family tradition. "I was in the neighborhood and thought we could have lunch, just the two of us." The lunch was at an expensive restaurant where she'd apparently made reservations in advance. Not so spontaneous after all. She waited until we'd ordered to bring up what she called her proposal. "I've been doing some research, Rebecca, and I think we need to have a serious conversation about your financial situation." Here it comes, I thought, cutting into my salmon with deliberate precision. Inherited wealth comes with responsibilities that, frankly, darling, you're not equipped to handle alone. The tax implications alone are staggering. And then there's estate planning, investment diversification, philanthropic obligations. She paused for effect, probably expecting me to look overwhelmed. "I think it would be best for everyone if I helped you manage these assets. We could set up joint accounts, establish proper oversight, make sure everything's being handled appropriately." "Appropriately according to who?" I asked, not looking up from my plate. "According to people who understand these things. Rebecca, according to family." That word, family, coming from a woman who'd spent 21 years treating me like an obligation rather than a daughter, was almost funny enough to make me laugh. "I'll consider it," I said instead, because I'd learned from my grandparents that sometimes the best response is the one that reveals nothing. But I'd already decided what I was going to do. It was time to start protecting myself. 3 weeks after our spontaneous lunch, I received an official letter that changed everything. Not from Mom directly. She was too smart for that. The letter came from Patterson, Williams & Associates, a law firm that specialized in what they delicately termed family financial disputes. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the essential message was clear. My mother was petitioning the court for conservatorship over my assets, claiming I was mentally incompetent to manage my inheritance. I read the document 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of calculated cruelty. According to the petition, I was emotionally unstable, financially inexperienced, and susceptible to manipulation by parties seeking to exploit her substantial inheritance. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The petition included affidavits from people I barely remembered, distant relatives who claimed to be concerned about Rebecca's welfare, former boarding school acquaintances who apparently remembered me as troubled and isolated, even our old housekeeper who supposedly witnessed my erratic behavior during childhood visits. Every single statement was either completely fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. Yes, I'd been quiet as a child, but that was because I was surrounded by adults who treated me like an inconvenience. Yes, I'd been focused on my studies, but that was because academic achievement was the only thing that earned any recognition in my family. But presented together in legal language, these observations painted a picture of someone who couldn't be trusted with her own life, let alone a substantial inheritance. The most damaging allegation was the claim that I'd isolated my elderly grandparents from their loving daughter and influenced them against their family through emotional manipulation. According to Mom's version of events, I was some kind of master manipulator who'd spent years turning my grandparents against her for financial gain. Anyone who'd actually known my grandparents would have laughed at that suggestion. Eleanor and Charles Morrison weren't people who could be manipulated by anyone, especially not a child or teenager. They made their decisions based on decades of observation, not momentary influence. But the court wouldn't know that. The court would only see the carefully constructed narrative of a concerned mother trying to protect her unstable daughter from making disastrous financial decisions. I called Mr. Pemberton immediately. "I've been expecting this call," he said when I explained the situation. "Your grandparents anticipated this possibility." That stopped me cold. What? "Rebecca, your grandparents were extremely intelligent people who understood family dynamics better than most. They knew there was a possibility that their decision to leave everything to you might be challenged." "What does that mean?" "It means they prepared for this scenario. Can you come to my office this afternoon? There are some documents I need to show you." 3 hours later, I sat in Mr. Pemberton's office staring at a collection of materials I'd never seen before. Medical evaluations of my grandparents' mental state right up until their deaths. Psychological assessments proving their competency. Detailed financial records showing their careful decision-making process over several years. But the most interesting document was a thick folder labeled Rebecca Morrison, Character Assessment and Competency Documentation. "Your grandfather compiled this over the past 5 years," Mr. Pemberton explained. "Academic records, employment evaluations, financial management records, even testimonials from your professors and supervisors. It's essentially a comprehensive dossier proving your competency and character." I flipped through pages of documentation I didn't even know existed. My Harvard transcript, performance reviews from Morrison Financial, bank statements showing my careful savings and responsible spending patterns, even letters from people I'd worked with describing my professionalism and capability. "He knew this might happen," I said, understanding flooding through me. "Charles Morrison was a businessman who planned for every contingency. He loved you, Rebecca, but he also believed in you. This documentation proves that his decision wasn't based on favoritism or manipulation. It was based on evidence." The final document in the folder was a handwritten letter from grandfather Charles, dated just 2 weeks before his death. "If you're reading this, it means someone is trying to take away what you've earned through your character and capabilities. Don't let them. You are exactly the person we raised you to be. Strong, intelligent, and capable of defending yourself. Use these tools. And remember that the best defense is often a good offense." I looked up at Mr. Pemberton, feeling something shift inside me. Not fear anymore, but determination. When do we fight back? Mr. Pemberton's strategy was methodical and absolutely ruthless. Over the next 6 weeks, we prepared for war with the kind of thoroughness that would have made grandfather Charles proud. Every document was organized, every witness statement verified, every piece of evidence cataloged with military precision. "Your mother's legal team is expecting you to fold under pressure," he explained during one of our late-night strategy sessions. His corner office overlooked the harbor, and I could see the lights of ships coming and going as we worked. "They're counting on you being overwhelmed by the process, intimidated by the accusations, willing to accept a settlement just to make it all go away." I sipped my coffee and reviewed the latest batch of character witnesses we'd compiled. Former professors, colleagues from Morrison Financial, even the property manager from my apartment building, all ready to testify that I was exactly the opposite of everything Mom's petition claimed. "What they don't realize," I said, highlighting another relevant section in my employment reviews, "is that you don't get raised by Eleanor and Charles Morrison without learning how to fight properly." The discovery phase revealed exactly what I'd suspected, and a few things that genuinely shocked me. Mom's legal team had submitted financial records requesting access to my accounts, but they'd made a crucial error. In trying to prove I was incompetent, they'd also had to provide evidence of their own involvement in my financial affairs. That's when we found the first irregularities. "Rebecca, look at this," Mr. Pemberton said, spreading out bank statements across his conference table. "These are copies of transactions your mother's team submitted as evidence of your reckless spending patterns. But look at these dates." I leaned forward, studying the highlighted entries. Transfers, account openings, even credit applications, all bearing dates from when I was in college and graduate school, all supposedly authorized by me, all handled through accounts I'd never opened. "She's been using my name and social security number for years," I said, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. Look at this credit card application from when I was 22. I was in Boston that entire semester. This was filed from Connecticut. Mr. Pemberton nodded grimly. Your mother has been committing identity theft and financial fraud for at least 6 years that we can document. Possibly longer. But why submit this as evidence against me? Doesn't this prove she's the one who can't be trusted? That's exactly what I'm wondering, he said, adjusting his glasses. Either her legal team didn't review these documents carefully enough, or they're assuming the court won't notice the discrepancies. Both possibilities suggest they're getting overconfident. What do you think will happen next? Leave your predictions in the comments below. We spent the following week documenting every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every account opened without my knowledge or consent. The pattern was clear and damning. Mom had been systematically using my identity to access credit, open accounts, and make financial decisions in my name, all while building a case that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs. The beautiful irony, Mr. Pemberton observed, is that by submitting these records as evidence of your incompetence, she's actually provided us with documented proof of her own criminal behavior. But the discovery that really changed everything came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the list of character witnesses Mom's team planned to call, I noticed a name I recognized: Patricia Henley, the woman who'd been Grandmother Eleanor's personal assistant for almost 15 years. I need to call Patricia, I told Mr. Pemberton. If she's testifying for Mom, something's very wrong. Patricia knew my grandparents better than almost anyone. The conversation with Patricia revealed the true scope of what we were dealing with. Oh, Rebecca, she said, her voice heavy with relief when I called. I've been hoping someone would contact me. I need you to know I never agreed to testify for your mother. That law firm called me and asked questions about your grandparents' final years. I told them the truth about how sharp and competent Charles and Eleanor were right up until the end, but somehow my name ended up on their witness list anyway. What exactly did you tell them? I told them about the precautions your grandparents took in their final years, how they had regular medical evaluations specifically to document their mental competence, how they consulted multiple attorneys about their estate planning, how they spent months researching the legal requirements for ensuring their will couldn't be contested. Patricia paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. I also told them about the private investigator. That stopped me cold. What private investigator? Your grandfather hired someone to investigate your mother's financial activities about 2 years before he died. He'd suspected for some time that she was accessing accounts using your name, but he needed proof. When the investigator confirmed it, that's when Charles really started preparing for this exact scenario. Do you still have contact information for this investigator? Better than that. I have copies of his entire report. Your grandfather asked me to keep them in case they were ever needed. I think now qualifies. 3 days later, I sat in Mr. Pemberton's office reviewing the most comprehensive documentation of financial fraud I'd ever seen. The private investigator had traced Mom's activities back nearly 8 years, documenting not just the identity theft, but a pattern of financial manipulation that included forged powers of attorney, unauthorized account access, and what appeared to be systematic theft from elderly clients she'd worked with in various capacity roles. This changes everything, Mr. Pemberton said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction that suggested he was already planning our courtroom strategy. We're not just defending against a conservatorship petition anymore. We're in a position to file criminal charges. But won't that make this personal? Turn it into a family vendetta instead of a legal proceeding? Mr. Pemberton smiled, and for the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt like we might actually win. Rebecca, this was always personal. Your mother made it personal when she decided to try to steal your inheritance through the court system. The only difference now is that we have the ammunition to make her regret that decision. Judge Harrison Mitchell had a reputation for running his courtroom like a military operation, punctual, professional, and completely intolerant of legal gamesmanship. At 68, he'd seen every type of family dispute imaginable, and his weathered face suggested he'd developed little patience for manufactured drama, which made Mom's choice to wear her grieving, concerned mother costume, complete with understated makeup that somehow highlighted her worry lines, seem particularly miscalculated. Your Honor, her attorney began, his voice dripping with practiced sympathy, we're here today because a loving mother is concerned about her daughter's ability to manage a substantial inheritance responsibly. Mrs. Morrison has observed behavior patterns that suggest Rebecca may not be equipped to handle these financial responsibilities without proper oversight. I watched Judge Mitchell's expression carefully as Patterson, Mom's lead attorney, launched into his opening statement. The judge's face remained completely neutral, but his eyes were sharp and attentive. This wasn't someone who'd be swayed by theatrical performances. Rebecca Morrison inherited approximately $8 million in assets when her grandparents passed away 18 months ago, Patterson continued, gesturing toward a stack of financial documents. Since then, she has made numerous questionable decisions without consulting family members or seeking appropriate professional guidance. We're not asking the court to remove these assets from Rebecca. We're simply requesting that proper oversight be established to protect both her interests and her future. The words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable, protective, rather than predatory. If I hadn't known the truth about Mom's motivations, I might have found the argument compelling. Mr. Pemberton's opening was notably shorter and more direct. Your Honor, this is not a case about protecting a vulnerable young woman from poor financial decisions. This is a case about an estranged mother attempting to gain legal control over assets she believes she should have inherited herself. The evidence will show that Rebecca Morrison is not only competent to manage her inheritance, but has demonstrated remarkable financial acumen since receiving it. More importantly, the evidence will reveal that the petitioner has been engaging in systematic financial fraud using her daughter's identity for nearly a decade. That got Judge Mitchell's attention. He leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening. Furthermore, Mr. Pemberton continued, we will demonstrate that by filing this petition and submitting certain financial records as evidence, the petitioner has inadvertently provided documentation of her own criminal activities. Mom's face went completely white. Apparently, her legal team hadn't warned her that we might take this approach. Mr. Pemberton, Judge Mitchell said, his voice carefully controlled, those are serious allegations. I trust you have substantial evidence to support them? Extensive evidence, Your Honor, including documentation compiled by a private investigator hired by the deceased grandparents specifically to investigate these activities. Patterson was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly prejudicial and overruled. Mr. Patterson, your client filed this petition claiming incompetence and requesting access to substantial assets. Mr. Pemberton is entitled to present evidence regarding his client's competency and the motivations behind this legal action. Continue, Mr. Pemberton. The first day of testimony proceeded exactly as we'd planned. Patterson called his character witnesses, people who claim to remember me as withdrawn and difficult to connect with during my teenage years. Their testimony was weak and obviously coached, consisting mainly of vague observations about my personality rather than any concrete evidence of incompetence. More damaging were the financial experts Patterson had hired to analyze my spending patterns since inheriting. They painted a picture of someone making impulsive purchases and risky investments without proper research or consultation. Ms. Morrison purchased a $70,000 vehicle within 6 months of inheriting, testified Dr. Richard Hoffman, an economics professor Patterson had recruited as an expert witness. She also made several large charitable donations and invested significant amounts in what appear to be speculative technology stocks. These patterns suggest someone who lacks the emotional maturity to handle substantial wealth responsibly. It sounded convincing until Mr. Pemberton began his cross-examination. Dr. Hoffman, did you research the specific vehicle Ms. Morrison purchased? Well, the amount seemed excessive for someone her age. The vehicle was a certified pre-owned Tesla Model S with exceptional safety ratings and minimal depreciation, purchased after 3 months of research and comparison shopping. Are you suggesting that purchasing a reliable, environmentally conscious vehicle is evidence of incompetence? Not specifically, but the amount. Did you examine the charitable organizations Ms. Morrison chose to support? Dr. Hoffman shuffled his papers uncomfortably. The amount seemed large relative to her age and experience. Organizations that provide educational scholarships for underprivileged students and support elder care facilities. The same types of causes her grandparents had supported for decades. Does continuing her family's philanthropic traditions indicate incompetence, Dr. Hoffman? I simply meant that someone her age might not fully understand. As for the technology investments you characterized as speculative, did you research the specific companies involved? By the time Mr. Pemberton finished dismantling Dr. Hoffman's testimony, it was clear that every financial decision I'd made had been carefully researched and strategically sound. What Patterson had tried to present as evidence of poor judgment actually demonstrated exactly the opposite. But the real turning point came when Patterson called his final witness, Mom herself. She took the stand wearing a navy blue suit that projected maternal authority, her blonde hair styled in a conservative bob that made her look like someone's trusted neighbor. Her voice was steady and concerned as she described her growing worry about my ability to handle the inheritance responsibly. I've tried to offer guidance, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But Rebecca has become increasingly isolated, defensive about any suggestion that she might benefit from help or advice. This isn't about money, Your Honor. This is about making sure my daughter doesn't make decisions she'll regret for the rest of her life. It was a masterful performance. and I could see at least one person in the gallery nodding sympathetically. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have been moved myself. Then Mr. Pemberton stood up for cross-examination, and everything changed. "Mrs. Morrison," Mr. Pemberton began, his voice pleasant and conversational, "you've testified that you're concerned about your daughter's financial decision-making. When did this concern begin?" "It's been growing gradually," Mom replied, maintaining her composed, motherly demeanor, "probably starting around the time she inherited from her grandparents." "I see. And before that inheritance, how often were you in contact with Rebecca?" A slight pause. "We spoke regularly." "How regularly? Weekly? Monthly?" "It varied depending on our schedules." Mr. Pemberton approached the witness stand, holding a thick folder. "Mrs. Morrison, I have phone records from Rebecca's cellular provider covering the 5 years before her grandparents' deaths. According to these records, you called your daughter exactly 17 times during that entire 5-year period. The longest conversation lasted 4 minutes and 32 seconds. Does that sound like regular contact to you?" Mom's composure flickered for just a moment. "Phone records don't show the full picture of a family relationship." "You're right. Let's talk about in-person visits. During those same 5 years, how many times did you visit Rebecca at college or at her apartment?" That's difficult to quantify exactly. "Would you say it was more than 5 times? More than 3 times? Even twice?" The silence stretched uncomfortably long. "Mrs. Morrison, please answer the question." "Our family doesn't express affection through constant visits and phone calls," Mom said, her voice developing a defensive edge. "We believe in independence, in allowing young adults to develop their own lives. Yet now you're asking this court to remove that independence entirely," Mr. Pemberton observed. "Interesting shift in philosophy. Let's move on to your financial concerns about Rebecca's inheritance management. You've testified that she's making poor decisions without consulting family members. When exactly did she consult you about financial matters before the inheritance?" "We discussed her college choices, her career path. I'm specifically asking about financial consultation. Did Rebecca ever ask you for money? Did she ever seek your advice about investments or major purchases?" "No, but in fact, isn't it true that Rebecca has been financially independent since college graduation and has never asked you for any form of financial support?" "That's not the point." "What is the point, Mrs. Morrison? Why is a woman who has been completely self-sufficient for 6 years suddenly in need of your financial oversight?" Mom's face was beginning to flush, the careful makeup not quite concealing her growing agitation. $8 million is a significant amount of money. Anyone would benefit from proper guidance. "Let's talk about proper guidance," Mr. Pemberton said, his tone sharpening slightly. "Are you familiar with an account at First National Bank opened in Rebecca's name in March of 2019? The color drained from Mom's face so quickly I thought she might faint. "I don't know what you're referring to. Let me refresh your memory." Mr. Pemberton pulled out a bank statement and handed it to her. "This is a credit card application filed in Rebecca's name while she was attending classes in Boston. The application was filed from your address in Connecticut and uses your handwriting. Can you explain how that happened?" Patterson was on his feet. "Objection! This is outside the scope of this proceeding. Your Honor," Mr. Pemberton replied calmly, "the petitioner has asked this court to determine whether Rebecca Morrison is competent to manage her finances. Evidence of fraudulent activity using her identity is directly relevant to both her competency and the motivations behind this petition. Overruled. Mrs. Morrison, please answer the question." Mom stared at the document for a long moment, her hands visibly shaking. There must be some mistake. Mrs. Morrison, I have 14 similar documents spanning 7 years. Credit applications, bank account openings, even loan applications. All filed in your daughter's name, all from your address, all in your handwriting. Would you like to explain these mistakes?" The courtroom was dead silent. I could see Patterson frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, his expression no longer neutral but deeply concerned. "I was trying to help her build credit," Mom began weakly. "Without her knowledge or consent? I had power of attorney. Please show the court this power of attorney document." Another long pause. It wasn't formal, but as her mother..." "Mrs. Morrison, there is no such thing as informal power of attorney. Either you had legal authorization to act on your daughter's behalf, or you were committing fraud. Which was it?" Patterson tried another objection, but Judge Mitchell waved him off. The judge was now studying Mom with the kind of attention that suggested he'd moved from interested observer to active investigator. "Let's move on to something else," Mr. Pemberton continued relentlessly. "You testified that you're concerned about Rebecca's isolation from family. When did you last attempt to maintain a relationship with her outside of financial matters? We've always had a close relationship, Mrs. Morrison. When is Rebecca's birthday? The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Mom's eyes went wide with panic. Her birthday? It's in the spring. What date? I don't see how— Your Honor, this is a simple question about basic family knowledge. If Mrs. Morrison is genuinely concerned about her daughter's welfare, surely she knows when her daughter was born. Judge Mitchell nodded grimly. Answer the question, Mrs. Morrison. Mom's voice was barely audible. April, something. I'd have to check my calendar. April 15th, Mr. Pemberton said matter-of-factly. Rebecca's birthday is April 15th. She's 28 years old today. Actually, happy birthday, Rebecca. I hadn't even realized it was my birthday until that moment. In all the stress of preparation, I'd completely forgotten. But Mom had forgotten too, and everyone in that courtroom could see it. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Pemberton continued, his voice now carrying an edge of disgust, you don't know your daughter's birthday. You've had minimal contact with her for years. You've never provided financial support or guidance. Yet you're asking this court to believe that you're suddenly concerned about her welfare enough to take control of $8 million in assets. Isn't it more accurate to say that you're upset you weren't included in your parents' will? And you're using this court proceeding to try to gain access to money you feel entitled to? That's not true, Mom snapped, her careful composure finally cracking completely. That money should have come to me. I'm their daughter. Rebecca manipulated them, turned them against their own child. She isolated them and filled their heads with lies about me. The outburst was so sudden and so venomous that several people in the gallery actually gasped. Patterson was trying to signal her to stop talking, but Mom was past caring about legal strategy. I'm their family. I'm blood, not some ungrateful little girl who couldn't even be bothered to visit them unless she wanted something. Mrs. Morrison, Patterson tried to interrupt. She turned them against me. Made them think I was some kind of failure. And now she gets everything while I get nothing? That's not how families are supposed to work. Judge Mitchell's gavel came down hard. Mrs. Morrison, that's enough. But Mom wasn't finished. Years of resentment and entitlement were pouring out in a torrent of self-pity and accusation. Do you know what it's like to have your own parents choose a grandchild over their daughter? To spend your entire life trying to live up to their impossible standards, only to watch them hand everything to someone who never had to work for anything? Your Honor, Mr. Pemberton said quietly, I believe the petitioner has just provided the court with her true motivation for this proceeding. Judge Mitchell looked like someone had offered him something unpleasant to smell. Indeed she has. Mrs. Morrison, please, step down. The atmosphere in the courtroom the following morning was completely different. Word had spread about Mom's meltdown the previous day, and the gallery was packed with reporters, legal observers, and what appeared to be several people from the financial community who'd known my grandparents. Judge Mitchell entered with an expression that suggested he'd spent the evening reviewing case law and wasn't pleased with what he'd found. Before we continue, he announced, I want to address the allegations that emerged during yesterday's testimony. Mr. Pemberton, you've alleged systematic identity theft and fraud. These are serious criminal matters that may require referral to appropriate authorities. I want to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Mr. Pemberton stood, carrying several thick folders. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to call Patricia Henley as a witness. Ms. Henley was personal assistant to Rebecca's grandparents for 15 years and has information directly relevant to both Rebecca's competency and the circumstances surrounding this petition. Patricia took the stand wearing a simple gray suit, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 63, she had the bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing complex affairs for demanding employers. Her testimony was methodical and devastating. Mr. and Mrs. Morrison began taking specific legal precautions approximately 3 years before their deaths, she explained in her precise professional voice. They had regular competency evaluations performed by multiple physicians. They consulted with several estate planning attorneys, and in their final year, they hired a private investigator to document certain financial irregularities they'd discovered. What kind of irregularities? Mr. Pemberton asked. Unauthorized credit accounts opened in Rebecca's name, loan applications filed without her knowledge, several instances where Mrs. Morrison, the petitioner, had attempted to access accounts using Rebecca's social security number and personal information. Patterson objected strenuously, but Judge Mitchell allowed the testimony to continue. The private investigator's report, Patricia explained, had documented not just the identity theft involving me, but a pattern of financial manipulation that extended to several elderly clients Mom had worked for in various assistant roles over the years. Mr. Morrison, Rebecca's grandfather, was particularly concerned, Patricia continued. He said he'd seen this pattern before in business, where people used family relationships or positions of trust to gain access to assets that weren't legally theirs. He was determined to protect Rebecca from any attempt to manipulate her inheritance. The bombshell came when Patricia described the additional precautions my grandparents had taken. In their final months, Mr. and Mrs. Morrison established what they called a fraud protection protocol. They created detailed documentation not just of their decision-making process, but of every interaction they'd had with family members regarding their estate planning. Patricia paused, glancing at me. They also recorded several conversations with Mrs. Morrison where she made it clear she expected to inherit everything. Recorded conversations? Judge Mitchell asked sharply. Yes, Your Honor. Audio recordings made with Mrs. Morrison's knowledge and consent during family meetings about estate planning. Mr. Morrison was very careful about the legal requirements. I felt my heart stop. My grandparents had recorded Mom's conversations? Mr. Pemberton approached the witness stand with a small digital device. Ms. Henley, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit A47. Can you identify this? It's one of the audio recordings Mr. Morrison made during a family meeting in his study approximately 8 months before his death. Mrs. Morrison had come to discuss the estate planning, and Mr. Morrison wanted to have documentation of exactly what was said. With the court's permission, I'd like to play a brief excerpt from this recording. Judge Mitchell nodded, and suddenly my mother's voice filled the courtroom. Not the careful, concerned tone she'd used in her testimony, but her real voice, sharp with entitlement and barely controlled anger. Charles, this is ridiculous. You cannot seriously be considering leaving everything to Rebecca. She's 26 years old. What does she know about managing this kind of wealth? This kind of responsibility? My grandfather's voice was calm and measured in response. Rebecca has demonstrated excellent judgment in every aspect of her life. Her academic achievements, her professional success, her personal character, all suggest she's exactly the kind of person who should be trusted with family assets. Personal character? Mom's laugh was harsh and dismissive. She's barely part of this family. When does she visit? When does she call? She shows up for holidays and acts like she belongs here, but where was she when you needed her? When Eleanor was sick? Rebecca was here every weekend for the 6 months of Eleanor's illness. My grandfather replied firmly. She took leave from her job to help with medical appointments. She's the one who researched treatment options and coordinated with doctors. Where were you, Sandra? The silence on the recording stretched uncomfortably long. That's different, Mom finally said. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. But this inheritance... This is family money, Charles. Morrison family money. It should stay in the family. Rebecca is family. She's a grandchild. The inheritance should go to your children first, then to grandchildren. That's how these things work. That's how proper families handle wealth transfer. Proper families, my grandfather said quietly, make decisions based on character and capability, not just bloodlines. This conversation is over, Sandra. The recording ended, leaving the courtroom in absolute silence. Patterson was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this recording is highly prejudicial and taken out of context. Mr. Patterson, Judge Mitchell interrupted, his voice cold with displeasure. Your client just spent 2 days testifying that she's concerned about Rebecca's welfare and wants to protect family interests. This recording suggests her real motivation is anger about not inheriting assets she felt entitled to. How exactly is that taken out of context? There was no good answer to that question, and Patterson seemed to know it. He sat down without another word, but Mr. Pemberton wasn't finished. Ms. Henley, are there additional recordings? Several, including one made just 3 weeks before Mr. Morrison's death where Mrs. Morrison explicitly stated that she intended to challenge any will that didn't include her as primary beneficiary. The courtroom erupted in whispered conversations. Judge Mitchell called for order, but I could see he was struggling to contain his own reaction to what we were hearing. Your Honor, Mr. Pemberton said, I have 2 more brief recordings I'd like the court to hear. They go directly to the heart of this competency proceeding. The first recording was from a conversation between Mom and my grandfather about my career at Morrison Financial. She's wasting her education, Mom's voice said, playing around with other people's money instead of doing something meaningful with her life. How is that supposed to prepare her for real responsibility? Sandra, my grandfather replied, Rebecca manages portfolios worth more than $30 million. Her clients trust her with their retirement savings, their children's college funds, their entire financial futures. If that's not real responsibility, I don't know what is. It's not the same as family money. Family wealth requires understanding heritage, tradition, the importance of maintaining social connections and community standing. Rebecca treats money like it's just numbers on a spreadsheet. Rebecca treats money with the respect and careful analysis it deserves. She understands that wealth is a tool to be used wisely, not a symbol to be displayed carelessly. The second recording was even more damaging. "Charles, you're being manipulated," Mom's voice said, tight with frustration. "Rebecca is playing the perfect granddaughter role to secure her inheritance. Don't you see what she's doing? She's isolated you from your real family, made herself indispensable, and now she's positioned to inherit everything. It's textbook elder manipulation." My grandfather's response was swift and firm. "Sandra, Rebecca didn't isolate us from anyone. She's the only family member who maintained a genuine relationship with us. She visited regularly before Eleanor got sick, not just during family emergencies. She called to share good news, not just when she needed something. She treated us like people she enjoyed spending time with, not like ATMs with interesting stories." "That's exactly what I'm talking about. She's been grooming you for this." "No, Sandra, she's been loving us. There's a difference." When the recording ended, Mom was staring at the floor, her face completely drained of color. Every word she'd spoken in her testimony about being concerned for my welfare, about family bonds and protecting my interests, all of it had been exposed as calculated deception. Judge Mitchell leaned back in his chair, studying Mom with an expression of complete disgust. "Mr. Patterson," he said finally, "does your client wish to withdraw this petition?" Patterson whispered urgently with Mom for several minutes before responding. "No, Your Honor. We maintain that regardless of Mrs. Morrison's motivations, Rebecca still requires proper oversight for such substantial assets." It was a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage, but Judge Mitchell's expression suggested it was far too late for that strategy. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Pemberton, do you have additional evidence regarding Rebecca's competency?" "Just one more witness." "Your Honor, I'd like to call Rebecca Morrison herself." Taking the witness stand felt surreal, like stepping into a spotlight I'd never wanted, to defend capabilities I'd never thought I'd need to prove. The courtroom was packed to capacity, and I could feel dozens of eyes watching my every move as I swore to tell the truth. Mr. Pemberton's questions were straightforward, designed to let me tell my own story without legal jargon or tactical maneuvering. "Rebecca, you inherited approximately $8 million 18 months ago. Can you tell the court what you've done with that inheritance?" I'd prepared for this moment, organizing my thoughts and documentation with the same precision I brought to client portfolios. I've maintained the existing investment structure my grandparents established, which was already performing well. I've made some adjustments to increase diversification and reduce risk exposure, but nothing dramatic or speculative. Can you give the court specific examples? Certainly. I moved approximately 15% of the equity holdings into more conservative bond funds and treasury securities. I established a separate charitable giving fund that mirrors my grandparents' philanthropic interests. And I've set aside funds for ongoing property maintenance and taxes on the various real estate holdings. Have you made any major purchases? I bought a vehicle to replace my college car, which was becoming unreliable. I also upgraded my apartment to something more appropriate for my income level, though I kept the property investment conservative, and I've continued my grandparents' tradition of supporting educational scholarships. Nothing sounds particularly reckless or incompetent about those decisions. Can you tell the court about your professional background? This was where I felt most confident. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School and have worked at Morrison Financial for 4 years. I currently manage portfolios for 12 high-net-worth clients with combined assets of approximately $45 million. My performance reviews have been consistently excellent, and I've never had a client complaint or regulatory issue. Rebecca, your mother has testified that you've isolated yourself from family and made these financial decisions without consulting anyone. Is that accurate? I glanced at Mom, sitting at the plaintiff's table with her arms crossed and her jaw set in a hard line. I consulted with the same financial advisors my grandparents used. I worked with their estate attorney to ensure all transfers were handled properly. I've maintained relationships with several of their longtime business associates who knew their investment philosophy. The only family member I didn't consult was my mother, because she'd never shown interest in my financial decisions before, and frankly, I didn't trust her motivations. Can you explain what you mean by that? This was the moment I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. The chance to finally tell the truth about our family dynamic without worrying about being diplomatic or preserving relationships that had never really existed. "My mother abandoned me when I was 7 years old," I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. "She left me with my grandparents and built a life that didn't include regular contact with her daughter. For 21 years, she treated me like an obligation she had to acknowledge occasionally, rather than a child she wanted in her life." I could see several people in the gallery nodding, and even Judge Mitchell's expression had softened slightly. When my grandparents died and left me their estate, suddenly my mother developed an intense interest in my welfare and my financial decisions. This wasn't maternal concern. This was anger that she hadn't inherited money she felt entitled to, combined with an opportunity to gain control over assets through legal manipulation. Patterson stood to object, but Judge Mitchell waved him down. The witness may continue. Your Honor, my mother didn't even know my birthday when she testified yesterday. She can't name my college major, my employer, or any of my professional achievements. She's never visited my apartment, never met any of my friends, and couldn't tell you basic facts about my life. Yet she's asking this court to believe she's qualified to make decisions about my financial future? I pulled out a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. I brought documentation to prove my competency, but honestly, I think the burden of proof should be reversed. Anyone seeking to remove legal rights from another adult should have to prove extraordinary circumstances justify that action. My mother hasn't even proven she knows me well enough to make those judgments. Mr. Pemberton nodded approvingly. Rebecca, if this court grants your mother conservatorship over your assets, what do you believe will happen? I believe she'll systematically drain the accounts for her own benefit, just like she's been doing with my identity for years through fraudulent credit applications and unauthorized account access. The difference is that this time it would be legal, because the court will have given her permission to control my finances. One final question. Do you want a relationship with your mother? The question caught me off guard, and I felt tears welling up despite my determination to remain composed. I wanted that relationship for 28 years. I kept hoping she'd decide I was worth her time and attention, but I've learned that you can't force people to love you, and you can't build real relationships on manipulation and financial control. I paused, looking directly at Mom for the first time since taking the stand. If my mother wanted to be part of my life, she could have called me on my birthday. She could have visited my apartment. She could have asked about my career or my interests or anything about who I am as a person. Instead, she hired lawyers to try to take my inheritance. That tells me everything I need to know about her priorities. When I finished testifying, the courtroom was completely silent. Patterson chose not to cross-examine me, probably recognizing that any questions would only reinforce the picture I'd painted of our family dysfunction. Judge Mitchell called for a brief recess, and as I returned to the defendant's table, I felt something I'd never experienced before. The certainty that I'd told my truth completely and honestly, without trying to protect anyone else's feelings or preserve illusions about family loyalty. Whatever happened next, I'd finally stood up for myself. Judge Mitchell returned to the bench after only 15 minutes, his expression grim and his body language suggesting he'd reached a decision that left him deeply disturbed. I've presided over family court proceedings for 23 years, he began, his voice carrying the weight of genuine moral authority. I've seen every type of family dispute imaginable. Custody battles, inheritance fights, competency hearings that involved genuinely impaired individuals who needed protection. This case is unlike anything I've encountered. He looked directly at Mom, who was sitting rigidly upright, her hands clenched in her lap. Mrs. Morrison, you have presented this court with a petition claiming your daughter is incompetent to manage her inheritance. The evidence presented during this hearing proves exactly the opposite. Rebecca Morrison is not only competent to manage her assets, but has demonstrated exceptional judgment, professional expertise, and careful consideration in every financial decision she's made. Judge Mitchell paused, consulting his notes before continuing. More troubling, however, is the evidence that your petition was motivated not by concern for your daughter's welfare, but by your own anger about being excluded from your parents' will. The court has heard audio recordings of conversations where you explicitly stated your belief that you should have inherited these assets, and your intention to challenge any will that didn't benefit you directly. Patterson started to rise, but Judge Mitchell held up a hand to stop him. I'm not finished. The court has also heard extensive testimony about fraudulent financial activities conducted in your daughter's name over a period of several years. Credit accounts opened without her knowledge, loan applications filed using her personal information, systematic identity theft that continued even as you were preparing to file this competency petition. Mom's face had gone completely white, and I could see her hands trembling. Mrs. Morrison, by submitting financial records as evidence in this proceeding, you have inadvertently provided documentation of your own criminal activities. The court is therefore taking several actions today. Judge Mitchell's voice grew stronger, more decisive. First, the petition for conservatorship is denied in its entirety. Rebecca Morrison has full legal capacity to manage her assets, and this court finds no evidence whatsoever to justify removing that capacity. I felt a wave of relief so intense I almost started crying right there at the defendant's table. Second, All financial records and documentation submitted during this proceeding will be forwarded to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal fraud charges. The evidence suggests a pattern of identity theft and financial manipulation that extends beyond this family dispute. Mom made a sound like a small animal in distress, and Patterson was frantically scribbling notes. Third, given the frivolous nature of this petition and the apparent bad faith motivations behind it, Mrs. Morrison will be responsible for all court costs and reasonable attorney fees incurred by the defendant. But Judge Mitchell wasn't finished. Finally, I want to address something that troubles me deeply about this entire proceeding. Mrs. Morrison, you abandoned your daughter when she was 7 years old. You maintained minimal contact with her throughout her childhood and young adulthood. You never provided financial support, guidance, or meaningful parental involvement in her life. His voice grew harder, more condemning. Yet when she inherited assets from the grandparents who actually raised her, you suddenly developed intense concern for her welfare. This court finds that behavior not just hypocritical, but morally reprehensible. You are not entitled to control or benefit from assets you did nothing to help create, manage, or preserve. Mom was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and frustration that her plan had failed so spectacularly. Judge Mitchell stood and the entire courtroom rose with him. Ms. Morrison, he said, addressing me directly, you have demonstrated remarkable grace and dignity throughout this ordeal. Your grandparents chose their heir wisely. This court wishes you success in managing your inheritance and building the life you deserve. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in conversation. Reporters were already typing furiously on their phones, and several people from the financial community approached to shake my hand and express their support, but I barely noticed any of it. I was watching my mother as Patterson helped her gather her papers with shaking hands. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of her true motivations and the complete failure of her legal strategy. Part of me felt sorry for her. Part of me wanted to walk over and try to salvage something from the wreckage of our relationship. But the larger part of me, the part that had been shaped by years of disappointment and rejection, felt only relief that it was finally over. As Mom walked toward the courtroom exit, she stopped and turned back to look at me. For just a moment, our eyes met across the space that had always existed between us. I thought she might say something, an apology, an explanation, maybe even an acknowledgement of what she'd put me through. Instead, she straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin with the artificial pride I remembered from childhood, and walked out of the courtroom without a word. Mr. Pemberton was gathering documents and accepting congratulations from colleagues, but I remained seated at the defendant's table for several more minutes, trying to process what had just happened. It was over. The inheritance was secure, the legal threats were eliminated, and I was free to build whatever life I wanted without looking over my shoulder for the next attack. But more than that, I'd finally been heard. A judge, a courtroom full of witnesses, and public record would forever contain the truth about our family dynamic. I wasn't the ungrateful daughter who'd manipulated her grandparents. I wasn't the incompetent heiress who needed protection from her own decisions. I was exactly who my grandparents had believed me to be, someone who'd earned her inheritance through character, capability, and genuine love. 3 months later, I received notification that the State Attorney General's office had filed criminal charges against my mother for identity theft and financial fraud. She eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial and received 3 years of supervised probation, along with restitution requirements for the fraudulent accounts. I never heard from her again. The inheritance allowed me to start my own financial planning firm, specializing in helping families navigate complex wealth transfer issues without destroying their relationships. It's satisfying work, helping people avoid the mistakes my family made, and ensuring that financial decisions are based on merit rather than manipulation. If this story resonated with you, make sure to like and subscribe for more true stories about family, money, and the courage it takes to stand up for yourself. Sometimes the best thing you can do for toxic family members is refuse to enable their behavior, no matter how much it costs you emotionally. Because in the end, you can't change people who don't want to change, but you can absolutely refuse to let them destroy your life in the process.